Good afternoon. This is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada. Today is Wednesday, June the 3rd, and this is one more of my series of podcasts. And today I have a very special and I think very interesting guest. Today with me is Anthony Scaramucci of SkyBridge Capital fame, and I think also very interestingly of the Salt Talks fame. And I'm sure we're going to have an interesting, wide-ranging, robust conversation, including talking about tax policy generally and how it impacts Americans abroad. Anthony, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, John, great to be on. I appreciate the opportunity, and you got a great podcast, lots of interesting ideas, and you're a bit of a policy wonk, which I really enjoy.
Well, we're going to do a bit of that today. But speaking of policy and that, I have been listening to your Salt Talk series. Not all of them, but I really do enjoy them. And I'd like to do a plug for them right now because I think they're so interesting and beneficial. So could you begin by talking a little bit about your creation, SALT Conference? And I gather it's because of the COVID-19 thing that you're doing this series of one-on-ones with people.
Yeah, exactly right. So we created the SALT Conference after the last crisis. So coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, the city of Las Vegas, similar to today, was decimated. You could blow cannonballs through the hotel rooms there. And so for a very, very low price, we were able to book a big swath of hotel rooms and conference center rooms. And we hosted a conference in March of 2009. It was more or less at the low of the crisis. And so that led to us making it an annual event. It grew exponentially. We've had 2 American presidents, President Bush and Clinton, 6 defense secretaries, 3 secretaries of state, 4 UK prime ministers. I probably sound like I'm name dropping, but not really trying to do that. It's just basically high profile people in politics, high profile people in policy. We've had some entertainers there. One of the more tragic stories in 2017, we had Kobe Bryant there after he had retired. He gave an amazing speech. He was recommended to us by Magic Johnson. And so I try to make it a eclectic blend of people that are excellent in their fields, so that people that are trying to learn a new business or trying to get a gist of something going on in the world, maybe outside their expertise, they can tap into these events. We've done the event in Vegas 10 times, twice in Singapore, once in Tokyo, and once last December in Abu Dhabi. But unfortunately, our May event, which was supposed to be in Las Vegas, was canceled. The casinos were closed. And so we'll likely not have another event until next May. But my team introduced SALT Talks. And so in lieu of the event, we're getting speakers that would typically show up, and I'm getting a 45-minute opportunity, similar to what you and I are doing today, to talk to them. So upcoming would be General Kelly, the former White House Chief of Staff who fired me. We've ended up having a great relationship post my firing. So it's always fun to get together with him. Valerie Jarrett from the Obama administration. I've got Mark Cuban kicked it off. Great conversation on entrepreneurship and the business of sports. And so basically, it's a very eclectic mix of people. Yesterday, I interviewed Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, who's one of the leading experts on artificial intelligence globally. He now lives in Beijing, and we were talking about the ways artificial intelligence is going to enhance and improve innovation, productivity, healthcare, et cetera. So I'm glad you like them, and if you have ideas for people, maybe we can get you on there as well. I think it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great. I notice you've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Hammond, I think, coming at the end of June.
Yes.
It's a relatively new announcement. That should be extremely interesting. But what I really like about it is how global the thing is. You've got like people from all over the world. The first one was incredibly interesting because you had a gentleman who actually graduated from the University of Waterloo near me in Canada, who presumably, went to the United States on a green card, and a great American success story.
You're
So
talking about Chamath?
yes, yes,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
very,
Yeah,
very
very
interesting.
interesting guy. Yep. He's one of the early executives of Facebook. He's obviously built a couple of very interesting companies, and he now owns a piece of the Golden State Warriors. I think he's the majority partner there.
I guess
And
he wasn't happy with last year's playoffs then.
well,
Yeah.
listen, I mean, you know what? He doesn't. I own a piece of the Mets, so he should thank his lucky stars he doesn't own them. I mean, these guys are a disaster, but that's a whole other topic. But I've got blessed with a lot of things in life, but I'm unfortunately, as Jim Cramer, my friend from CNBC, he says to me, "Thank God, please don't root for any teams that I like, because you are a pig pen when it comes to sports." And so I'm a Met, Jet, Knick, and Ranger fan, and let me tell you something, they don't win, and it's always pain. It's always a house of pain.
Well, they haven't won, but times change. Listen, I was living in the Boston area when the New England Patriots joined. It was either when the AFL was started, the New England Patriots, and they were the doormat of the league for years. So, I
Right.
just, it's like an alternative reality, to see what that team became. But
Yeah, no question.
yeah, but I mean, these are all interesting ventures, but I think it's probably very difficult to make a lot of money owning professional sports teams, but that's beyond my pay grade, so I don't know. Um, somebody you ought to have perhaps is to get Andrew Yang in your Salt Talks. I
Yes.
actually listened to your interview with him today,
Mm-hmm.
with your podcast, which I thought was incredibly interesting, but I'd like to use one exchange on it as an intro to our discussion about tax policy today. You made the point that so we're living in this COVID-19 problem, and all these restaurants have been shut down, and you were talking about the practical problems of the conditions necessary to get the economy restarted, and you said, well, a great thing would be, and your expectation is that they'll bring back the 100% deduction for business lunches, right?
I believe that, yes. I think it's a
Yeah.
good idea. I'm not saying it'll be permanent, but I could see that being a 2, possibly 3-year idea, and then phasing out over time, getting it back to where it is now.
Yeah, well, key point is that the reason I think that's a good trigger is that behind that is absolutely, as we all know, clear that tax policy has a huge impact on people's lives, their businesses, their profitability, et cetera, et cetera. For example, if the gentleman from the University of Waterloo, when he came to the United States, was still subject to taxation by Canada on a worldwide basis, I think his life probably would have been a lot more difficult
No
uh,
question.
than today. And, I'd like to kind of use that as an introduction to, what's a very dark side to the American tax system. And that is this business of imposing worldwide taxation on people who actually live in other countries, full paying tax residents of other countries, on the basis of a citizenship only, which generally
Yep.
means, that they just happen to have been born in the United States, and and that's their sole connection to the United States. What, in a general sense, is your impression, your views of this?
Well, I mean, let's provide some historical context, which obviously but I think that citizen-based taxation, we both know there's probably only 2 countries that actually do it. It's us and Eritrea, a very small country, and they have a 2% expat tax. You're carrying the full load in the United States. You're able to deduct your taxes from the country abroad, but you're going to get hit. In most cases, it can be a 7, 8, 9, 10% differential. So you're a citizen-based tax. I think let's talk about, because you and I both know the policy is to collect revenue, but there's also social policy implications to our tax code and social engineering. But I think in this case, it was to prevent people from leaving the country and quote unquote avoiding taxes. So the idea that you could make all of your money here in the United States and then leave and go into a lower tax realm. And so people were trying to snag people that way. You may remember the Durant family or Sir John Templeton. Some people then, fully renounce their citizenships and they go on to live in other domiciliaries and pay different taxes. So it's an arcane, antiquated system. Before we got the podcast started, you and I were talking about some of the things I don't like about the system. But the main thing I don't like about the system is middle-class people that are living abroad. And we don't know exactly how many people, but most of the time people are thinking it's 9 to 10 million expats. The middle-classers, they get destroyed in this situation. Situation, we have a mutual friend, you sell a house in Australia. What ends up happening is you're paying taxes in the United States off of the house that's being sold in Australia. So there's ways to change it, but the frustration is it never gets to anybody's radar, and there's no lobbying in the Congress, and there's no political discussion on any of the news channels, the cable news channels, or the business news channels about the need for reform. So it's almost like an orphan area of the IRS tax code. But I definitely think it's in need of reform, and I think it would be good for the United States. As you and I both know, those people, we'd love them to keep their citizenship, and in many ways, they're great ambassadors for the country abroad.
Oh, they're clearly America's greatest ambassadors. There's no doubt about that. One of the things that I think is important to understand about this whole citizenship taxation thing is that it's often a lot more than, a higher tax rate in the United States. To use your example of, say, selling a house in Australia or Canada or England or something, the tax systems in those countries don't actually tax the capital gain on a principal residence. So what happens is that if you're a U.S. citizen, you end up having to pay a capital gains tax on that house. You really become, if you're living in Canada or the UK, Australia, you really become sort of a permanently downwardly mobile person.
Yeah, you're disadvantaged. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, clearly so. And the people who have these small business corporations are absolutely being destroyed. Not only by the taxation, but by the incredibly onerous reporting requirements. For example, in Toronto, the form that's required for these small business corporations, the 5471. Anthony, as a businessman, that most small businesses don't make a lot of money. I hope yours do, but most of them actually don't. And the cost just to file these information returns can be like $5,000 a return plus. And
yes.
For most of humanity, that's a really significant cost. Along with penalties. And there's
I agree.
So I think that the part of the problem with the discussion of getting the these changes in the tax code on the radar is to begin to actually understand it, because you seem to understand it far better than most people in the United States. The gospel there seems to be that somehow the foreign tax credit rules or something make it so it's really a non-event, and that's certainly not true. But why do you think? Why do you think it's other than the fact that it's out of sight, out of mind? Why do you think it's hard to get such traction on this issue? Because this was pushed to at least the let's discuss it stage with the 2017 tax reform.
Yeah, well, listen, I think it's out of sight, out of mind because there's no lobbying for it. I hate to sound so cynical. I got my 11-day PhD in Washington, John. I tell my friends on Wall Street, I want you to imagine the worst person that you ever met on Wall Street. That's the best person in Washington. And so what happens here is, and it's a cynical comment, but what happens here without lobbying and without feathering somebody's bed inside the Congress, you're not going to get anything done. And I'll remind you, going back to the 2017 tax reform, we have something in the hedge fund industry called carried interest. And you can carry over your incentive allocation in a hedge fund comes to you in long-term capital gains as opposed to ordinary income. And the president was trying to take that out of the tax code in 2017, but the hedge fund industry had a super strong lobbying effort. And at about 11:59 on the evening of the signing of that tax reform, it got put back in. And that was done through lobbying. And so nobody's really in there lobbying. If those 9 million people got together and they hired a lobbying firm, you'd get a lot of work done. You left something out, but maybe your listeners already know this, but I do think it's worth repeating. You have housing allowances and school stipends. I'm working at XYZ company, and they say to me, okay, we want you to move to Hong Kong for us. Okay, great. How many years do you want me in Hong Kong? Well, we want you there for 5 years, and if you come back, we're going to make you a partner. Okay, great. I don't want to renounce my U.S. citizenship. I go to Hong Kong. They give me a housing allowance. They give me a school stipend to put my children in the American elementary school or the American junior high school there. All of a sudden, I'm walloped with taxes on that stuff. You know, that's not a benefit to me directly without me paying U.S. taxes, right? And to me, I think that's wrong as well. You know?
Oh, that stuff's incredible. In the I can send you a link to the article on this, but apparently in the 70s, the situation for people transfer over to Japan got so bad because of the cost of housing there, they're including that on the returns. Assuming this article is correct that I read, there were actually people subject to U.S. tax assessments, the amount owing, that actually exceeded their actual income received, if you can imagine. So,
yeah, I can imagine. It's hard to believe, but yes, I can imagine.
Yeah. So, what does somebody like that do? I mean, obviously, the answer is they do not leave the United States. They do not take these jobs. And the whole, origins of the foreign earned income exclusion, really was designed to, make it less expensive for American multinationals to hire U.S. citizens. And it's so restricted that it really doesn't do that. So, I mean, let's say you don't even care about it.
I think that deduction is still only 100,000, though, right?
It's only not only is it only 100,000, so basically, or 105 or something, but I mean it's basically very, very little. But the problem is it only applies to a very narrow category of income, making it effectively useless. And then if you got the problem, of course, of some kind of inclusion for some other reason, I mean, it can be a real disaster. I mean, it's an unbelievable disaster. I mean, the people who aren't affected by this, who file the taxes, and in many cases don't file the taxes properly, not intentionally, but because it's so complicated, nobody can even understand it. And this has gotten a lot worse because of the, the whole FATCA, foreign account tax compliant thing, which has got non-U.S. banks, basically turned in, they've been deputized by the IRS, if you will, to start hunting around for people with a U.S. place of birth. I mean, don't you think that particular regulation shouldn't apply to people who are actually living outside the United States and tax residents of other countries?
Yes, I totally agree. And I think that, again, if you talk about this from a libertarian perspective and trying to honor people's individual rights, just think about the notion of these people having they have a foreign bank account, and the bank account is required to not only notify the IRS, but it also has to release the information to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So the IRS literally acts like every foreign bank account owned by a U.S. expat is part of some kind of money laundering operation. So, the IRS sees a plain vanilla mutual fund in Europe, for example, and they treat it like it's a passive foreign investment company, and they go on the hunt for extensive disclosure. So to me, I think there's a combination of things. We want our citizens to be able to take opportunity abroad. We want them, if it's better for themselves and their families, to move to another country temporarily or even permanently. We don't want to lose them as citizens, right? You and I just talked about the quality of their ambassadorial nature of being spokespeople for the United States. but yet we are treating them like we have the East German police on them, watching their every move. And so I just think the system is incredibly flawed. And you know, and I said this to you before we started the podcast. I also believe the system is designed to target wealthy Americans that they view are stashing assets offshore, and they're living in the belief that these wealthy individuals are potentially evading taxes. So when they blanket these regulations and blanket these policies, maybe they're snipping a few of those. Maybe those people are just paying their taxes regularly without any evasion. But what they're really doing is they're killing the people, which are the majority of these people, which are middle class, upper middle class people that have to deal with all this bureaucracy and red tape.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned some of the people who've renounced, for example, Sir John Templeton. I've always found that absolutely fascinating, as a fascinating example of how tax policy impacts human behavior. Obviously, I can't prove this, but it was so as we know, Sir John Templeton was basically, pioneered the foreign investing, world, I think, foreign mutual funds.
Of
And
course.
that's what Templeton Growth Fund was. So in 1962, Congress enacts the Subpart F regime, right, which is basically to attribute income earned by foreign corporations to individuals. I mean, this is really, really horrible for somebody like him. It was in 1964 that he renounced his U.S. citizenship. I used to go hear Sir John Templeton speak because the mutual fund was actually based in Toronto, at least the legal apparatus. And he always mentioned that he renounced U.S. citizenship. Nobody ever asked him why, but I am 99% sure, given the timing of that he was basically forced out of U.S. citizenship by the creation of the Subpart F regime. And I mean, think of what that cost the United States, both in terms of the quality of the individual they lose, and very possibly the estate taxes and that sort of thing. But since that time, people have been forced out of U.S. citizenship. Today, if somebody who actually is a fairly middle-class American abroad wants to renounce U.S. citizenship, they are very, very likely going to be subject to the U.S. exit tax regime. They have a $2 million net worth, and what that could mean is, say you live in London, England, or somewhere, and you own a house. That's just what a house costs there, right? I mean, you're well on your way. And then say you have a pension or something, and all of a sudden you're what's called a covered expatriate. And if you renounce U.S. citizenship, there's an exit tax payable. What's interesting is the exit tax payable is paid on non-U.S. assets that were required during a period of time the person didn't even live in the United States. That's, one of the perhaps unanticipated, generally understood, but incredibly unfair consequences of the whole citizenship taxation regime.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's desperate need of reform. So imagine if you and I were the two lobbyists that were working on this. I mean, some of the things I would love to see happen for us as a country is we move more to a consumption-based model, and so you'd have potentially lower income taxes, higher exclusions, or a larger exemption than the one that we currently have for expats. And then, you'd be able to pick up some of the black market activity that's going on in the U.S., some of the cash transactions that goes on in the U.S. if you had a VAT, and you could probably cut corporate and income taxes a little bit and repeal some level of the alternative minimum tax and so forth. So to me, you've also got the 3.8% surtax on investment income, and just think about it for a second. You're earning money offshore. You're not participating in the healthcare system of the U.S., but you're going to pay those surcharges for, what are effectively the Obamacare tax. So to me, it's a flawed system. And what I would say to people listening, I've often thought about it this way: taxes are a price for services, and we both know if politicians are involved, they become an element of social engineering or social policy. But if you were just thinking about it for a second, price for services, in some ways, the expats are providing a service to the United States. You know, that ambassadorial nature and that exposition of Americans abroad actually helps America's standing. You know, we've heard our standing, I think, politically with people like President Trump, and we've heard our standing with the Iraq War as an example. But by and large, our citizens abroad are helping our standing. You know, when I travel and talk to people about America, they see the country probably more favorably than the way we're captured in the news cycle or captured in cable news here or in other countries. And I think a lot of that has to do with expats. So, I mean, it's for this and many other reasons that I think we need to reform this onerous section of the IRS tax code.
Well, maybe the reform should go further. Since the United States is benefiting from Americans abroad, perhaps the United States should pay a stipend or something to every U.S. citizen abroad rather than taxing them. I don't think we get that far, but you know, there may be a certain logic to that. You know, you make an interesting point where you say, well, that you know, one model of taxation that it's in return for services, and you know, Americans abroad actually do not get any services. But before we started recording this, we were talking about politics in general. You had mentioned that sort of a libertarian model of taxation would be that taxes were paid for services, but in a non-libertarian, a more traditional two-party Democrat-Republican state, that actually taxes have very little to do with services. They have to do with the implementation of social policy and perhaps, you know, in some cases, keeping congressmen happy. Um, I mean, do you think the country would be better if the political parties were reined in and it became less partisan?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about best practices. I get in a lot of trouble. I'm still a registered Republican, even though the party has really left the Ronald Reagan principles. It's become more of a Trumpist party, but I'm hoping, you know, and I sort of view what's going on in the Republican Party now as a worse schism than what happened between Reagan and Ford in 1976. And so hopefully at some point we'll begin a healing and a reunification of the party. But I would say yes. I think what happens is through the gerrymandering, cable news cycle, the reinforcement of people's views, we're even fighting over what the facts are now. We can't even agree on them. So that makes the debate even harder to have in the country. But if you talk about best practice, in my opinion, the mandatory voting in Australia is an example of best practices, because you're forcing, or, you know, you have to pay a fine if you decide not to vote, but you have to exercise your right to vote. You have to put your opinion in the domain. You can do it anonymously, of course. But what that does is it liquidates the extremes. You know, you start diluting those extremes and you get closer to the bell curve of where most people live. You know, most people, and I appreciate something you said about me after listening to the Andrew Yang thing, you see me as an independent. Yeah, I am a registered.
I actually do. Yeah, and I want to pick up on that
Yeah.
in a second.
Well,
You know,
I appreciate you saying that, because I am a registered Republican. My dad was a Republican. You know, the unions, this is sort of an obscure fact, but my dad was in a union. He was a crane operator out here on Long Island. And this is an obscure fact. The only person that I've met that actually knew this was David Axelrod, who was President Obama's campaign advisor. But Joe Margiotta, who ran the Republican Party, had a very tight control on those unions. So I was a kid. My father was like, "You're a Republican." So when I registered to vote in 1982 at the age of 18, I registered as a Republican. And I said, okay, I'm going to try to figure out what a Republican is. But philosophically, I really do see myself more independently streaked. I see myself more solutions oriented. And as I say about Andrew Yang, he's not left or right, he's forward. Okay. Or, you know, I like to see myself as not left or right, but looking at policies from a right or wrong perspective. You know, not trying to hold fast to ideological anchors, which may or may not help the country. You know, and I think we've got to get the country to a post-partisan position. Does that make sense?
Well, it
And
totally
if we
makes
if we
sense.
can get there, we're going to come up with a way better policy. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that, like, stop and think about it for a second. If you move from New York to Nevada, and I'm now 185 days or whatever the number is, 183 days in Nevada, I don't have to pay New York taxes anymore, right? Yet if I move from Nevada to Brisbane or to Toronto, okay, I'm now stuck in that quagmire. You see what I mean? And
Totally.
it's unfair. And so that unfairness, we should figure out a way to rectify. And trust me, there's a way. You're not going to lose a lot of revenue. If anything, you may create more flow of commerce and more activity. You know what I mean?
Well, one thing that occurs when you use the phrase flow of commerce. So we have United States has, as you know, had free trade agreements with Canada and Mexico since, I don't know, the late '80s,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and they've rebranded it. But the fundamental scope of the agreement is that there's a presumption of people and goods crossing borders in a way that helps both economies. And I have often wondered how in the world citizenship taxation can be compatible with these free trade agreements, where, for example, if a Canadian mutual fund is treated as a PFIC, a passive foreign investment company, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, it
Mm-hmm.
discriminates against a certain kind of person. So, I mean, I wonder if one way of approaching this problem might be to say, well, one of the problems with these extraterritorial tax policies is they really do burden these free trade agreements, and and they actually, I mean, they're a problem in other ways because they're a way of expanding a massive part of the U.S. regulatory regime out of other countries, outside the United States, to other countries. Big problem. Um,
We totally agree.
Going back to, I'd like to ask you, and you talked about the value added tax, and my reading of the United States in general is that the masses and the politicians are completely opposed to a value added tax. I don't understand why, because from my perspective, I think that they get out of the bureaucracy, internal revenue code, they're easy to collect. But the other thing is that value added taxes ensure that everybody pays tax, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So why I mean, do you
You're also
agree that
picking
these
up
are
the tourist
generally?
traffic. You're picking
Yeah.
up consumption, and some people say that it's regressive. I disagree because if anything, it's inclusive. You're just going to get a higher swath of revenues, and you're going to get it treated more fairly. So if I'm able to shelter my income and I'm able to shelter certain things from a tax perspective, you're going to get me on the consumption side.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you had asked me this question 30 years ago, 20 years ago, was I in favor of a value added tax, I would have said no. And I would have had very good, specific, clinical, libertarian, and conservative reasons why. But we're in a different world today. We have to accept that in the last 15 or 20 years, the income gap has extremely widened. Our deficit spending is out of control. And the haves and the have-nots have two different worlds. It's like living in a Charles Dickens novel, and we have to figure out if we want a better society. And I tell my friends this who are wealthy, you don't want to be living in a McMansion with a barbed-wired security perimeter and security guards. I mean, that's how they live in Latin America, and we don't want that in North America. We don't want that in the United States. I grew up in a blue-collar, aspirational working-class family. Those families right now, John, they can't make the money to live in the middle class. My dad's wages priced today, 40 years later, his sort of 2020 version of his job from 1980, it's down 26% in real economic terms. And so we have to figure out ways through tax and social policy and through the mechanisms of infrastructure and things like that to to make the society better for those people. And one of the ways to do that is to capture more tax. Because let me tell you something, that deficit is exploding, and it won't affect the wealthy because we'll inflate our way out of it. We'll monetize it. And so if the wealthy own the assets will just go up in value. But it's the middle class and the lower middle class that get destroyed, Yeah,
Could
please.
you? I would like for you. I was listening to your Andrew Yang thing, and you actually, I agree with you like 1,000%. But you expanded on that a little bit more in your Andrew Yang interview, and I think that's worth getting in here about what happened in 2008 when interest rates went to zero. I think what you had said that those who owned the assets, were the real winners on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, what I was trying to explain to Andrew is 2008, you had a number of tools that you could have used to help people and help the economy. Because the government is so polarized, they fail really to act on the fiscal side or long-term infrastructure policy, long-term educational policy, long-term entitlement policy. So what they do is they take the easy way out, which is let the Federal Reserve handle it. One of the reasons why we're having a problem right now in the balance of powers in the United States is about 40 years ago, the U.S. Congress ceded war powers to the executive. The debacle of the Vietnam War, these congressmen didn't want to go back to their districts and be blamed for voting for acts of aggression around the world. So we had a police action here or a police action there, and it was decided by the executive branch. It took power away from the Congress. That lopsided the balance of powers, right? And it's sort of the same thing now. They've turned over the economic policy to the Fed. And so what is the Fed? The Fed only has one blunt instrument, and that's the lower interest rate. So they dramatically lower interest rates. And what do you and I know? We know that interest rates are the financial gravity of financial assets. As they go lower, asset prices go up. Look at what's going on in the U.S. stock market since the March 23rd low. It's up 47% since the March 23rd low. It's climbing back to its high, which was reached at Dow 30,000. And why is that happening? Well, we jammed down the rates. Crisis started. We were at 150 basis points overnight. We took those rates to zero. And then we started the program of quantitative easing, which is lowering rates and injecting liquidity into the marketplace. It's showing up in asset prices, but that benefits the wealthy. It calms people down from an asset perspective, but it doesn't reach the lower and middle class. That trickle down, if you will, is not an effective way of improving the quality of life or the real wages of lower and middle income earners. So you have this byproduct of frustration. And if you look at the wealth divide numbers from the last crisis, and they're going to get exacerbated now because of this crisis, it's splitting. And so what I said to Andrew Yang is, ironically, Dr. Bernanke and Dr. Yellen, they created Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump because they've created these populist movements born from this level of frustration. Whereas if you could marry the monetary policy to a good infrastructure, long-term infrastructure policy, a long-term educational policy, you could flip those families. Those families could start thinking more aspirationally related to their economics and less desperationally. There's a lot of middle and lower middle income people here in this country that don't think that their children are going to do better than they are. My parents certainly didn't think that.
No, that's absolutely right. And on a very simple, practical level, what it's meant is the rise in asset values has meant that there are many young people who simply cannot and may never be able to afford a house today. So think of it, the 2008 financial crisis. What did it mean? Well, it means that average people, may never be able to afford a house, at least in larger centers, New York or London, whatever. I mean, it's absolutely shocking when you look at the longer term consequences of this type of stuff. So I think that part of the message here is that the mistake is reacting to circumstances rather than responding in a measured and long-term way. But as we sort of introduced there in that way, the question of policy. Tell me what your thoughts are on the upcoming election. It's hard to believe there actually is an election in 5 months.
Yeah, well, let me tell you something though. In Trump world, 5 months is 150 days, and it's and what I know from Trump world, 150 days is like 500 years, like taking the North American continent back to Christopher Columbus. I mean, there's no way anybody can predict where we're going to be in 150 days. And so just think about where we were 150 days ago compared to where we are right at this moment. Moreover, if you and I were talking, if we did this podcast 4 weeks ago, I would have said, okay, we're in a pandemic, we have a healthcare scare, we have an oil shock, we have a financial crisis, okay, and fast forward, we now have a racially charged riot and looting situation in 13 of our major cities. And so, you know, this cocktail, okay, could worsen. I hope it doesn't. I mean, the stock market is not reflecting it because of all the money that the Fed is putting into it. But I really believe that the economic situation in the United States is way worse than it was in 2008. The market's not reflecting that because of all the stimulus. So to me, you know, if the market doesn't recover, and I mean the economic market, not the stocks and bond market, if the overall economy doesn't
people's
recover,
ability to pay their bills.
Yeah, exactly. President Trump's not going to win. You know, and these are always referendums on the incumbent, meaning you tell me, you know, it's for Trump or against Trump. It's for Obama or against Obama. It's for Bush or against Bush. It's never really about the other person, you know, and what do we know from 100 years of electoral history in the United States? Since 1920, if you were an incumbent and you had a recession in the year of your incumbency, the electoral incumbency, you lost the election. So could President Trump defy that? Yes, he could possibly defy that because he's a strange beast. You know, he beat out the Access Hollywood situation as an example, and so he's a guy that could potentially defy these odds, but maybe not. You know, he may be in a situation where he's not going to be able to climb out of it. He's not going to have enough.
Well, clearly, it's not a good set of circumstances for him. But I agree with you. I have no sense that the verdict is in on that.
It's still his to lose. That's my opinion, because it's always about the incumbent, John. You know, that's, you know, and it's too early. If that economy starts recovering, he's a good salesman, you know, and these are marketing competitions.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be very, very interesting. And I don't think that, much useful information is going to come from the media or anything like that. I mean,
no, they want their commercial incentive is to make it a bigger and bigger circus.
Well, that is true. That is true. So what do you think about, the whole issue of democracy in trouble, and a partial help to it would be to move towards more independent candidates, an independent candidate running for president, expanding beyond the two-party system if you must have political parties. What's the very long-term goal here? I mean, clearly the problems of America are largely because of the two-party system and the partisan nature of politics. So these political parties are perfectly happy to hurt the country to help the party, right?
There's no question. The whole game for them is preservation of power more than it is the success of the overall people or the overall country. And so the incentives. Remember, the incentives are misaligned, and so that's the big problem in the country. But I'm going to tell you, since 1992, when they had the Ross Perot scare, where he spent quite a big sum, self-funded, got 19.9% of the vote, and people can say whatever they want, but more or less, he is the reason that George Herbert Walker Bush didn't win re-election. And so those two parties conjoined and created a very powerful, very structured duopoly after that scare. And so candidate Trump looked at running for president as a Reform Party candidate in 2000. And he looked at it and said, NFW, there's no way I can do this because the hoops, I've got to get XYZ numbers of petitions here, ZYX over there. I've got this morass of the voting thing and the registration and getting people out to vote and all of the grassroots mechanisms that are sedimentary to those two parties. And so the bad news is we're stuck with these two parties for the foreseeable future. That's why, for me, I would be pushing and shaming them to reform by having mandatory voting. Because if you have mandatory voting, then all of a sudden you see those two parties getting forced out of these boxes of extremism.
Well, I think that's right. It's interesting you make the point that President Trump had considered running as basically an independent. I actually do see him as an independent candidate who understood, one, he was an independent, but understood, two, that he had to latch on to one of the political parties to win.
Exactly right. And he was vacillating between those parties. He was a Democrat for a period of time, became a Republican, Democrat. He's run as a Republican. And the Republicans are, pushing their agenda through him. And so even though he's done things that are offensive and he's done things that Republicans are not in love with, they're willing to hold their nose because he is, by and large, promulgating a lot of the policies that these people like.
Yeah, and I think that a lot could be said for President Obama, that he was also an independent, who latched onto the Democratic Party. So,
exactly. But again, ironically, both of these guys became tribal leaders, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They were Obama. So anyway, but I mean, that's just what's going on.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm not going to ask you if you want to make an independent run for president. Maybe you'll consider it down the road, but
I don't know. Yeah, I got to get Andrew. I got to get Andrew Yang on your podcast. I'll have to tell him about your podcast and get him on. Okay, I think he's gung ho to run again in 2024.
Oh, he's running. I have no doubt about that. And I think it's good that he's running. Whether he wins or
he's an important voice, John, because he's a practical guy and he's an open-minded guy.
Exactly, and I think a lot of times people can make as much impact by running, although it's not as evident at the time as even winning. And he is, I think, a very, very valuable, important voice in the political discussion, whether you agree with him or not.
No question. No question. I agree with that.
Yeah. Listen, can we pick this up closer to the election?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to come back on anytime.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic. Really enjoyed chatting with you today.
Oh, well, me too. And I appreciate the opportunity. Let's stay in touch. And I will, as I'm on my travails on policy, I'll send you stuff that I think is interesting to support some of the work that you're doing. And I applaud you for the stuff you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And to the extent that you can help, get this topic into the tax discussion, the political discussion, absolutely greatly appreciated. Great
We're
talk.
Working on it.
Really enjoyed it. And we will pick it up again. Thanks so much, Anthony.
Okay, great.